everybody, and welcome to another episode of Zay Historicizes. It has been a while, I think 5 or 6 months now, since the last time that I'm filmed, and if you can tell from the background, you can see that obviously I am in a new setting. So I did move in August. It's not enough to excuse not filming or recording for the last 5 or 6 months, but again, I have moved recently. I also did get a new cat, so there have been several life updates. However, I did feel that it was very, very appropriate to go ahead and sit in front of the camera once again to do another episode of Zay Historicizes. It's really been a long time coming, and last weekend we had a lot of snow, more than we usually get in this area, and it just made me think about getting into the routine of researching and posting again. I've also really been in a reading arc in my life. I don't even know how to really explain that other than the fact that I've been reading a lot, and which has also inspired me to once again go ahead and get in front of the camera. One thing that also really prompted this is the fact that I feel like a lot of the topics that I've actually talked about on Zay Historicizes in the last year have only gotten more relevant, and one of the most relevant conversations that is happening right now is surrounding immigration, primarily immigration from Latin America. And I felt like, even though I've touched on immigration before, I've touched on immigration in my video with the model minority myth, with Asian and Chinese immigration here to the United States, as well as immigration from European immigration tied to the crisis of masculinity. I thought that it was very necessary for me to really historicize immigration from Latin America, because that is the most politicized area in which a lot of immigration is happening today. And with the current political situation surrounding ICE and the DHS, it only feels like as if that conversation is a lot more relevant and a lot more ever present concerning the political happenings of right now. So what I really wanted to do was go ahead and actually historicize immigration as it concerns to Latin America. And this video primarily is going to be historicizing immigration from Mexico, historicizing the plight and the route of Mexican immigrants to the United States, and the way that that has been policy in the United States, the way that the United States has encouraged and discouraged it, and the general perception of the United States tied to Mexican immigrants, Mexican Americans, and the way that, just their relationship with the United States overall. Again, that is something that is heavily politicized. Immigration has always been heavily politicized in a nation that is literally, of course, founded by immigrants. But I figured that it was something that I really feel like I need to get to. So again, this video is going to be tied to historicizing immigration from Latin America, but primarily from Mexico in this first part. So I'm going to go ahead and get this video started. A really big part about historicizing immigration from Mexico into the United States, or I guess a really good starting point, is going to be really just acknowledging the fact that the western portion of the United States used to be Mexico. So states like Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, the Oregon territories, that was all part of the Spanish Empire and was part of the country of Mexico up until the mid 1800s. So in the 1840s, President Polk at the time really provoked this war with Mexico because he wanted to expand the United States all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And in provoking this war, he was again trying to gain those territories. The United States actually offered to purchase that from Mexico, but the Mexican government had declined that. So the Mexican-American War was a way to, again, push the boundaries of the United States all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So the war was finalized in 1848. That was when the war ended, and the United States was successful in that war and was able to incorporate the western portion into what we now know as the United States. And there are two things to note here. One, with the incorporation of that territory into what is now the United States, you do have this disruption of historical migration patterns. So once that was all part of Mexico, you do have these migration patterns where people are essentially moving from what would eventually be places like New Mexico and Arizona into Mexico. But now that the border has been drawn there separating Mexico and the United States, it is actually going going to disrupt those historical migration patterns that had been, of course, those migration patterns that had been experienced by those people for generations up to that point. Secondly, in 1848, you have the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and that treaty is going to grant citizenship to everybody who is now part of that, essentially everybody who lives in the territories that are now incorporated into the United States. So the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is significant for that reason, that all of those individuals get citizenship, and that is something that I'm going to get into a little later. However, the Mexican-American War, which again is complete in 1848, is that portion. It is that period in history where so much of Mexico is grabbed by the United States, is attained by the United States, and becomes United States territory. So that's a really good place of really starting the process of historicizing immigration with Mexico. It really just starts with the fact that a significant portion of Mexico used to actually be what we now consider the United States. With the conclusion of the Mexican-American War in the 1840s, we aren't going to see a really big spike with the arrival of a lot of Mexican immigrants to the United States until you get to the Progressive Era. And that is something that occurs in the era of World War I, because that is also the exact same time that you have the Mexican Revolution take place. So the Mexican Revolution is going to occur again in the 1910s when World War I is happening. And World War I is something that is going to create labor shortages in the United States. These are the same labor shortages that are going to encourage the beginning movements of the Great Migration of a lot of African Americans up to northern cities like Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia. So those labor shortages need to be filled by migrants and immigrants, and the United States at this time is actually going to encourage the immigration of thousands of Mexican workers to fill these agricultural shortages in the United States, as well as even the recruitment of troqueros, who are railroad workers. So the Mexican Revolution, I'm not going to get too much into the Mexican Revolution, but I am going to get into U.S. involvement in the Mexican Revolution. So the Mexican Revolution really starts when Victoriano Huerta, takes over the presidency in Mexico. And Victoriano Huerta is going to be really controversial with then President Woodrow Wilson because he prioritizes German and British oil interests over United States interests. What he's really trying to push for is for more Mexican overall control over the oil in Mexico. And it's very interesting because I feel like the oil is always like the rise of the United States villain origin story. But it is worth noting that Francisco Madero is backed by the United States because he does have a more pro-United States policy when it comes to the way that Mexico is going to run its oil. So the United States is fully backing revolutionaries in Mexico. And this is going to peak with the 7th-month occupation of Veracruz. So this is something where of course, the United States is actually sending troops in to occupy the state of Veracruz for this reason. It is worth noting, of course, that as with any revolution, you have this increase of violence. And as the United States and oil companies are funding those revolutionaries, you have this increase in overall economic instability, and you have this decrease in the standard of living. And that is going to drive thousands of Mexican refugees and immigrants to the United States, again, at the exact same time that you're experiencing these labor shortages due to World War I. So in 1917, you have an Immigration Act passed that incredibly favors immigrants from Northern and Western European countries. So the Immigration Act of 1917 is something that is going to bar immigration from the Asiatic zone, that is immigrants from Asia and the Middle East, as well as immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. So these are all ways that the United States is really just trying to make sure that the stock coming to the United States have this, Northern and Western European heritage, Slavic, Nordic, things like that. However, it is very important to note that even though you have this Immigration Act passed, which includes literacy tests as well as head taxes, the United States is going to waive those things for Mexican migrants. The need for Mexican labor is going to outweigh this incredibly racist immigration law. So the United States is still fully encouraging the migration of Mexican migrants into the United States to fill these labor shortages in agriculture and railroad workers, as well as other industries. So even though you do have this Immigration Act passed in 1917, the United States is essentially going to look the other way to make sure that Mexican migrants can fill these labor shortages. And that is incredibly insignificant in the overall arc of Mexican immigration to the United States. And this is a pattern that we are going to see time and time again. You're going to see errors where the United States is fully encouraging immigration from Mexico, and other times where Mexican immigrants do have this very negative perception, and they're pushing for the deportation of these individuals. But the Mexican Revolution overall is going to change the demographics of Mexican immigrants in the United States. Between 1910 and 1930, that demographic is going to triple in population. Mexican immigrants go from around 200,000 to 600,000 by 1930. So 200,000 in 1910 to 600,000 by 1930. So this is a very, very significant change that you do see occur with the Mexican Revolution. That is again happening simultaneously with World War I. So the Mexican Revolution is going to drive a large wave of Mexican immigrants to the United States. And between 1910 and 1930, you have the population of Mexican immigrants to the United States quite literally triple from 200,000 to 600,000, which is of course incredibly significant. However, something happens in 1929. I'm sure you've heard about it. It's the stock market crash, which leads into the Great Depression. And like with anything that occurs in the United States, economic need is always going to drive social policy. So when the United States is now facing its own depression, you have this new view of Mexican immigrants as essentially being direct competition for white workers. And this is something that's incredibly significant because the United States essentially really switches its overall position on Mexican immigration. Whereas the United States was at one point really encouraging the immigration of Mexicans to the United States, now you have where the United States is really quelling that immigration and trying to put a stop to it entirely, as well as the mass deportation of Mexicans back to Mexico. And this is what's going to define the repatriation period in the 1930s, where millions of Mexicans, up to 2 million, are going to be rounded up and deported back to Mexico. So this little piece of this article, section of the newspaper that I'm going to be reading, is titled "County Saves Large Sum by Mexican Repatriations." And this is something that comes out of the Monrovia News Post on March 4th, 1933. This is Monrovia, California. So I'm going to read a snippet of this section here. So, "County Saves Large Sum by Mexican Repatriations. Los Angeles, March 4th. Saving more than $2 million to Los Angeles County taxpayers, 36,200 Mexicans have been sent back to their native land during the last 2 years through a combined repatriation program of the County Welfare Bureau and the Mexican government. Besides affecting this huge saving to the county by eliminating them as indigent charges, the repatriates have also reduced the number of unemployed workers competing for jobs." So I'm going to go ahead and stop reading there. But the writer of this article is framing the deportation of Mexicans in two ways. One, it's saying that it's saving the county a ton of money. But at the same time, it's also this way of saying that now that we're getting rid of these workers, thousands of workers, we're essentially reducing the competition from a lot of American workers who are looking for jobs. And in economic depressive times, you do see once again where the powers that be are essentially driving these wedges between working class people by essentially saying that you're competing for jobs with this individual. And of course, in true fashion, people fall for it every time. One of the things that is incredibly controversial, however, about the Mexican repatriation period is that a lot of people who are deported, up to half of them, are actually United States citizens. A significant portion are actually born in the United States as well. So it's not just the rounding up of people who are illegals, it is the rounding up of individuals who actually do have legal documentation proving that they can work in the United States, up to and including legal United States citizens. So this next article that I'm going to read This is just, again, a quick snippet, but this is titled Mexican Deportation Not to Cause Labor Shortage. So again, there was this fear tied to the deportation of Mexicans and how that was going to cause a lot of labor shortages, specifically because they work in a lot of industries that the average American does not necessarily want to work in. So this next section that I'm going to read, Mexican Deportation Not to Cause Labor Shortage, is something that comes out of the Times Record News in Wichita Falls, Texas. And this article is dated May 25th of 1929. So the same year where you're really getting into the Great Depression. This is Austin, Texas, May 24th. Deportation of Mexican laborers who have violated special contract permits, allowing them to remain in Texas 6 months, will not create a shortage of farm workers. State Commissioner of Labor Charles McKenney said today. McKenney has just returned from Houston, where he conferred with U.S. Secretary of Labor James J. Davis, whose trip to Texas was for the purpose of mapping a definite program for deporting Mexicans found without proper papers. So I really want you to pay attention to the verbiage here because it does tie to legal documentation and the ability to work with proper papers. However, what, again, I mentioned earlier is that the repatriation period is going to deport half of the people deported during the repatriation period are United States citizens. So again, it is actually not tied to proper documentation and proper working papers or even legal status. This is a way for the United States to hone in on a specific look or aesthetic, that is the Mexican migrant worker, and essentially getting these people, rounding them up through these raids and deporting them. And again, up to 2 million workers are going to be deported forcefully to Mexico. And once again, half of those individuals are actually United States citizens. So whereas during the Mexican Revolution and the labor shortages of the 1910s, you have the encouragement of Mexican immigration from the United States government. When you get into the 1930s and you get into the Depression period, the United States is going to frame those same workers as being in direct competition with United States citizens, and from there justify the mass deportation of many of these workers, many of whom are also United States citizens, back to Mexico. So as Mexican repatriation peaks in the 1930s, you are once again going to have the forceful removal of millions of Mexican workers, many of who are United States citizens, back to Mexico, back to their homeland. However, in true fashion, the United States is once again back at war. And as the United States is back at war, what does war, of course, cause? It causes labor shortages. So as you get into the 1940s, of course, in 1941, you have the beginning of U.S. involvement in World War I following Pearl Harbor. And into 1942 and 1943, the participation of the United States in World War II. Did I say World War I? The participation of the United States in World War II is going to once again cause labor shortages in the United States. And is in true fashion, when you have labor shortages, the United States is now once again encouraging the migration of Mexican workers back to the United States. It is such a hilarious whiplash is the only way I can really describe it, because whereas I did read those two previous articles concerning the competition that Mexican workers have with United States workers, now we are seeing this essentially this complete 180 where the United States media is now looking to actually encourage the migration of Mexican workers to the United States. So this next article or brief section that I'm going to read here is titled Get Manpower from Mexico. McNutt Reaches Pact for Unskilled Workers. And this is from the Kalamazoo Gazette in Michigan, Kalamazoo, Michigan, May 2nd of 1943. So McNutt Reaches Pact for Unskilled Workers. Washington. War Manpower Chief Paul V. McNutt announced Saturday that Mexican labor to meet this nation's needs for unskilled laborers, for unskilled industrial workers, is now available under an agreement concluded by the United States and Mexican governments. He said that 6,000 Mexicans would be brought in soon for work as track laborers on railroads in the southwestern and Pacific Coast states. orders for the workers have been placed with U.S. Employment Service officers by the Western railroad companies. Under an agreement reached last summer, Mexicans have been coming in for work on farms. The Agriculture Department said Friday that between 35,000 and 50,000 are expected to be brought in for farm work this year. So again, this is titled Get Manpower from Mexico. And we are seeing that the United States has switched its overall tune on Mexican migrants, and now the immigration from Mexico is fully being encouraged. I'm going to read a really brief snippet from this article titled, "The Axis Can't Lay a Finger on the Sugar Grown Inside Our States." And this is from the San Francisco News, February 18th of 1943, so that same year. In spite of labor shortage, California farmers this season have harvested a big crop of sugar beets. City folks and school youngsters pitched in to gather this energy crop, and smiling Mexicans, good neighbors from the south of the border, came by the hundreds to work in our sugar beet fields. So I'm not going to read the entire article, but I did want to definitely hone in on this idea of the smiling Mexicans and how the perception of minorities is often tied once again to economic needs, which are going to drive social policy in the United States. So again, in the 1910s, when you had labor shortages from World War I, the immigration from Mexico was significant enough for the United States to essentially quell the standards of the Immigration Act of 1917 to encourage the migration of Mexican workers to the United States, waiving those things to encourage their migration here. In the 1930s, however, when you have this economic depression, Mexican workers are framed as competing with American workers for jobs. However, now that you have the labor shortages occur in the 1940s, the United States of America is once again fully encouraging the migration of Mexican workers to the United States. What makes World War II different, however, is that in World War II, you do have the founding of the Becerra program. So the implementation of the Becerra program, which is between the United States and the Mexican government, is going to full-blown encourage the migration of Mexican workers to fill this agricultural work that is needed to be done in the United States. And over 4 million, up to nearly 5 million Mexican workers are going to be recruited to work in the agricultural sector in the United States. The Becerra program is going to last from 1942 to 1964, so it is certainly more significant and more sound and grounded than a lot of what would have been established in World War I. However, we do see that the Becerra program is going to offer a minimum wage, is going to offer adequate housing and conditions for a lot of agricultural workers, but that is not going to be a reality that a lot of them are going to face. A lot of workers are going to be subject to paying really low wages. Obviously, there is going to be even things like wage theft, and is going to be a ton of discrimination and abuse that is going to be meted out on these workers. It is just overall exploitative, and this is going to feed eventually to the calls to unionize agricultural workers in the United States, and obviously pushing for the rights that you are going to have in the 1960s and 70s with leaders like Cesar Chavez. But again, the Becerra program is going to be this legal pathway for millions of Mexican workers to once again go and fill the agriculture, to really participate in agricultural work in the United States of America. So again, it is an incredibly significant thing that does happen. So you definitely see the United States flip in that way in its overall reaction towards Mexican workers. And the Becerra program is a really great way to really see the way that the United States is essentially desperate for Mexican workers to fill these labor shortages that are now being had and experienced because of World War II. There's a very common pattern of migration in United States history, and that is known as chain migration. So chain migration is something that you see occur with the Great Migration of Black Americans out of the South, and you're going to see it with a lot of Mexican workers as well. Typically, the farm worker that is being hired to work in the agricultural sector, as well as other industries like railroad, are men. So you have this idea where a lot of Mexican men are coming up and being recruited to work in these farms in the United States. And from there, once they've settled themselves, I guess to an extent, they are bringing over their wives and their children. So again, you see this with the Great Migration. You see this with Chinese migrants as well out in the West Coast. So it is a pretty common pattern of migration. And you see this as well with European migrants in the Gilded Age and in the Progressive era. So as you have these Mexican American men really settle and they are bringing their families over, what you have is these very significant enclaves of Mexican Americans that are starting to grow out of these. And these are people who are, of course, now fully ingratiated in these societies and the cities that they live in. One of the things that I mentioned earlier was the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was one that granted citizenship to all of the individuals who were now living within the new borders of the United States. What's really significant about that treaty, however, is that Mexicans at that time were essentially considered legally white people. So in order to really gain citizenship in the United States, whiteness was absolutely a factor. A 1790 Immigration Act stated that if you were a white male that had been living in the United States for up to 2 years, you were essentially granted citizenship. So for them to be granted citizenship after the Mexican-American War, it was essentially legally classifying them as white people. However, with this growing population of Mexican Americans and Mexican migrants in primarily states like Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, specifically cities like Los Angeles, what you really do have is this incredibly quickly growing minority of Mexican migrants who are living quite separately from white Americans. And in the 1930s, you have a white teacher, white students, white parents. You have white parents in California who are starting to petition for Mexican students and pupils to have their own schools because they don't want them going to school with their white children. And so California is starting to implement like almost essentially this separate secondary school program for Mexican students. And in the 1930s and the 1940s, you are going to have a lot of Mexican Americans take these things to the court of law, where they're essentially fighting for their own rights to full-fledged citizenship. One of these cases is the case of Mendez versus the Westminster School District in 1946. And the Mendez versus the Westminster School District starts from 10-year-old Sylvia Mendez, and 10-year-old Sylvia Mendez is essentially being barred to go to school in the Westminster School District because of her Mexican heritage. And the superintendent of schools very plainly states that the Mexican heritage of these students makes them inferior to the white students. So the Mendez case is going to go all the way to the California courts, and they're going to decide in favor of the Mendez family, stating that it is not constitutional to bar these students from attending these schools, and it's only being done because of their heritage. And this is a case that I had actually never heard of before, but it is actually going to feed into the later Brown v. Board of Education case in 1954, which is going to declare all school segregation unconstitutional. So the Mendez case is very significant, but you also have in 1944 the case of the People versus Zamora, which actually spurns from the Zoot Suit riots, in which a lot of the Los Angeles PD is essentially going around and arresting these Mexican American youth due to their appearance. And in the People versus Zamora case, the prosecutor very specifically looks at the youth that are arrested and points to their Mexican heritage and their appearance as a reason why they are being involved in this criminality. So as you have this quickly growing population of Mexican American Mexican immigrants and this quickly growing population of Mexican American youth, there is this perception of this demographic tied to criminality and just deviance overall. In the 1940s, you have the popularity of the Pachuco and Pachuca style. So Pachuco being for young Mexican American boys and Pachuca being for young Mexican American girls, where they are dressing themselves themselves up in these high-waisted pants, these large articles of clothing to really affirm their individuality. Essentially, it does become this piece of clothing that a lot of young Mexican American, Filipino American, and even Black American youth are wearing in the 1940s. And it overall becomes tied with criminality and just deviance overall. So the idea of these youth as being criminally deviant and up to no good is something that 100% fuels the Zoot Suit riots. So I did want to draw that chain between the chain migration occurring with Mexican American men, and then of course from there feeding into the overall growth of Mexican Americans in cities and the way that they are being racialized, because race is cast in United States history, and race is fully tied to the ability of individuals to participate in their government, essentially citizenship. And with the growing population of Mexican immigrants in the United States, what you are seeing is this racialization of Mexicans and the way that they are essentially going to now in the court of law have to fight for their own rights under the white supremacist blanket of the United States and the way that it views citizenship overall in this country. So with this really growing racialized perception of Mexicans in the United States, even during the era of the Becerra program, you are still going to have deportation campaigns. And one of the most popular campaigns that occurs in the 1950s, again during the era of the Becerra program, is going to be the Wetback campaign, which is something that happens under the Eisenhower administration. So this is fiscal year 1955, which ran from July 1st of 1954 to June 30th of 1955. And these wetback campaigns are going to be culminated with the deportation of hundreds of thousands of wetbacks. And a wetback, which is, again, it's a really offensive term, but a wetback is supposed to be essentially an illegal immigrant from Mexico, and it's associated with those who cross illegally into the United States across the Rio Grande. And again, this racialized perception is something that the United States can hone in on in the media. And from there, it is going to be once again associating Mexican immigrants with crime and criminality, which again, we saw during the Zoot Suit riots, as I mentioned earlier. So again, I'm going to go ahead and delve into some newspapers here. I figured that it was really important for us to see in real time the way that the United States was actually referring to these individuals and once again tying them to crime. So this article that I'm going to read is titled "The Wetback Problem. Southwest Takes Wetback Labor as Vested Right." And the section I'm going to be reading is Wetbacks Linked to Crime. So this is from a newspaper in Harlingen, Texas, dated May 3rd of 1951, which is a little bit before the campaign starts, but it is essentially the political climate that is going to encourage these wetback campaigns. The San Antonio Express last March quoted district attorney saying, quoted attorney Jack Ross of Edinburgh, Texas, as saying that in the previous year, as much as 75% of the convictions in certain major crime categories had been against wetbacks. And that since the stepped-up drive against them, crime generally has dropped off 50%. The newspaper added, without comment, that local police in several valley cities reported such petty crime as pilfering and drunkenness had dropped sharply. So again, this is very clearly a way to tie the Mexican immigrant and the Mexican American to crime. Specifically, of course, because this is literally titled Wetbacks Linked to Crime. So I definitely wanted to shed light on this article because it is once again that the United States has taken this racialized perception of this demographic, and by linking them to crime, essentially encouraging the ultimate wetback campaigns that will be undertaken by the Eisenhower administration later in the 1950s. And the wetback campaigns, even in the 1950s, are going to be incredibly unpopular because of the inhumane treatment that the government is going to met out on these individuals who they are deporting. You have a situation in Texas where 88 of these individuals are actually left to die in the Texas desert from heat exhaustion because they're abandoned there by officers. Officers are shaving people, they are beating them before they're detaining them to arrest them, and there is a particularly awful situation in the Gulf of Mexico where they are rioting because of these overcrowded cargo ships, and you have many of the deportees eventually drown in the Gulf of Mexico. So again, these are incredibly controversial campaigns, so much so that the wetback campaign actually only lasts one fiscal year because of how unpopular it is overall. And I'm going to go ahead and read this article. It's titled "The Middle Path" by a journalist, Tom Griffin, and this is from the era of the wetback campaign. This is titled "The Wetback Problem," and the reason I'm going to read this is because it does shed light on the conversations that are being had on both sides. So on one hand, you do have this idea of the wetback as this separate person who is being, they're criminals, they're dangerous, we need to get them out of here. But you also have this very sympathetic view of them as well, as you would have today. So I'm going to go ahead and read this. The Attorney General Brownwell has returned from his fact-finding trip to the southern United States weighing the wetback problem. He reports that the situation is aggravated. Legislation will be introduced to remedy the condition. Budget cuts have reduced the appropriation for the Border Patrol, and Mr. Brownwell will ask for adequate funds after a survey of needs of the problem is completed. There are some individuals who exploit the wetbacks, who hire them for work on their ranches, then turn them over to the authorities, and in that manner waive any remuneration due them. One may have compassion on the poor Mexican national who is unable to support his family on the Mexican side of the border. Who can say what we would do under the same depressing circumstances? The farmers who take advantage of these aliens and who are exempt from disciplinary action for employing them incur the sharp censure of civic-minded people. The wetback problem is a complex one, but let's make certain we hold responsible those at fault. Those who have sustained the wetback movement in this country. Those who hire the wetbacks are solely to blame. If the farmer refused to employ them, how many would cross the border illegally? Then it follows that the self-seeking farmers who make a practice of hiring these unfortunates are the cause. The wetbacks are the effect. This is an incredibly woke article for the 1950s, which is why I really love that section. But what the writer is essentially saying is that the wetbacks are essentially the effects of these farmers who are exploiting them fully. Again, the Becerra program, even though it does encourage the millions of Mexican workers to come here legally and find these contracts, it is also going to be this uptick of a lot of illegal immigration. And that is because these farmers know that they can better exploit individuals who are here working illegally and have crossed the border illegally and are essentially undocumented. So this article is really looking at that problem and saying that the wetback problem isn't really a problem of the wetback specifically, as it is a problem of these farmers who are exploiting these individuals and hiring them knowing that they do not have proper documentation to work. This is something that we are seeing happen in real time even today. And I also found it really interesting how the writer mentioned that they are hiring these individuals and then turning them over to authorities. I thought that was something that I definitely wanted to shed light on here. But again, the conversations that are being currently had today concerning the exploitation of undocumented workers are conversations that have been had for years in the United States. And this is a really good example to see actually the more sympathetic approach to the way that some individuals were viewing the wetback problem in the United States. Again, the wetback campaign is not popular at all and only lasts one fiscal year. The Eisenhower administration is going to say it's a way to secure the border. I forgot to mention that in 1924, when you have that first wave of Mexican immigration, you do have Border Patrol, which is established. So the Eisenhower administration is saying that the wetback campaigns are a way to secure the southern United States border. Sounds pretty familiar there, but you do have this very sympathetic approach from the United States public, and the overall situation with the wetback campaign, of course, with these human rights violations that are going to be associated with the campaign, are going to make the overall campaign incredibly unpopular, so much so that it only lasts one fiscal year. So definitely wanted to shed light on the wetback campaign and the racialization of Mexican immigrants as being separate from white people and how that feeds overall into the treatment of the Mexican immigrants, and of course the wetback campaigns in the United States. Here to report that my cats have officially sat the hell down, so let's go ahead and celebrate that. So again, the wetback campaigns do occur in the 1950s, and that deportation occurs again during fiscal year 1955, during the era of the Becerra program. However, the Becerra program is going to run until 1964. So it runs for 22 years. It ends in 1964, which is during the era of civil rights in the United States, because the face of things in the United States changed so heavily in the 1960s during the Lyndon B. Johnson administration. And I've mentioned the LBJ administration so often because that is the era where so many of the DEI initiatives that have come to define the United States up until today are being implemented. And one of those is the Immigration Act of 1965. So the Immigration Act of 1965 is incredibly significant because that act essentially ends preferential treatment of Northern and Western European migrants for United States immigration. So again, you always had this exclusion or barring of Asian immigrants, and the United States was really trying to quell immigration from the less desirables. But with the Immigration Act of 1965, all of that preferential treatment is removed for the most part, and it does shift the way that immigration is going to look in the United States up until today. So since the 1960s into the 1970s and so forth, a lot of immigration that is being had in the United States now is from Asian countries. It is from African countries, and it is going to be significantly from a lot of Latin American countries as well. To put things into perspective, around 68 million or 20 million Americans today are of Latin American descent, and you have around 10 million Mexican Americans, Mexican-born Americans that are living in the United States today. It is a decrease in percentage from what it was around 10 or 15 years ago in overall population. But again, the Immigration Act of 1965, which again are part of Johnson's DEI initiatives, is going to encourage more immigration from places like Asia, Africa, essentially places that are not European. That is the general political climate in which the Becerra program is going to end. And overall, comprehensive immigration reform comes in pieces in American history. So in 1965, you do have that act. But by the 1980s in the United States, Mexican workers account for 25% of immigrants working in agriculture. This is up to around 1.5 million people. And a significant portion of these individuals, 25% of them, are undocumented. In 1986, under the Reagan administration, you have IRCA, so that is the Immigration Reform and Control Act. This is going to see the SAW program, and the SAW program is the Special Agricultural Worker Program, and this is going to legalize over 1.1 million farm workers in the United States. So the percentage of undocumented workers drops from 25% to 10%. Which is incredibly significant. So this is sweeping immigration reform in the 1980s that is going to greatly reduce the percentage of undocumented workers in the United States of America. However, the article I just read from the 1950s, a generation before the SAW program, mentions that the wetback or the undocumented worker is literally just the effect for the cause. And that cause is these farmers and these corporations that are hiring undocumented workers purposefully and knowingly because it is easier to exploit them. So even though the Reagan administration sees the SAW program, which again drops the percentage of undocumented workers from 25 to 10%, by the late 1990s, this is a very significant statistic, by the late 1990s, just a decade later, up to 50% of workers in the agricultural sphere are going to be undocumented. So once again, even with sweeping immigration reform, up to half of the workers are going to be undocumented by the time you get into the late 1990s in the United States, showing that it's not just about law, it's not just about immigration reform. These farmers, these corporations are knowingly going to hire undocumented workers because they are more readily exploitable. And that is a very awful fact, but it does speak volumes about the way that immigration, or the cause and certainly the population of undocumented workers, specifically in the agricultural sphere, is tied to the fact that you have so many employers who are willing to hire these individuals to work these jobs in the United States. So just some statistics that I'm going to go ahead and read some current statistics here. So as of the 2023 to 2024 fiscal year, there are over 5.5 million undocumented migrants from Mexico in the United States, who account for roughly 40% of the total unauthorized population. And they do typically work in the agricultural sector. Their economic impact: in 2019, they contributed nearly $9.8 billion in federal, state, and local taxes, with over $82 billion in spending power. And roughly 96% of undocumented Mexican workers are employed, often filling essential labor-intensive jobs. So just a couple statistics that I wanted to read there. Again, I've always stated that economic necessity and economic competition is what's going to drive social policy in the United States. So whenever you see the overall treatment and perception of Mexican workers and undocumented migrants in the United States, you have to understand that this is something that is not new. These are tactics that have always been used in the United States to really pit the working class against one another. I'm just one of those people that I've just genuinely in my life, never cared. So whenever I do look at these statistics, it's just never been a thing in me to really stigmatize the individuals that are working, and again, these very essential jobs. But I did want to, of course, historicize this because it is incredibly important for us to see the way that the United States, based on economic need, has encouraged the migration of Mexican workers several times in US history, and the way that undocumented workers at the end of the day are being hired by these exploitative farms and companies and workers and industries who are hiring them specifically for the reasons of exploiting them. As that article I read from 1954, which again feels so relevant today, all these years later, states they are simply the effects of the cause, and that cause is exploitation. People who are going to hire these workers to work here, regardless of whether they have papers or not, because they know that they are more readily exploitable, up to and including turning them into law enforcement for several reasons. As of now, I did want to mention again that the overall Mexican-born population in the United States has actually decreased in the last decade. In fact, we are seeing an uptick in immigration from other Latin American countries like Venezuela, and then what we also view as the Northern Triangle, that is Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. And I'm actually going to get into immigration for those countries in the next part of this series from immigration from Latin America. But I think whenever we have these conversations in the United States, it is incredibly important for us to always historicize them. And when you historicize these things, you really see, as always, that nothing is new. Nothing is really new under the sun. I've always stated that. And the conversations that are being had about Mexican workers and Mexican laborers, from everything to being undocumented, from everything to being, crime and criminality, these are conversations that have been had so many times in American history, and really understanding them allows us to really see the way that we can approach these conversations and these policies in real time, in our time. I just felt that this was something that I felt was overdue. We really need to be exposed to the parallels of this immigration, and it's just important that we have this information in front of us. That was, as always, a bunch of reading. It was pretty reading intensive, but I felt that it was just really, really relevant with the political happenings of right now, to definitely historicize and shed light on the really, I guess I'm going to say interesting, I know I use that word a lot, diplomatic relationship that the United States has had with Mexico, and the way that has fully impacted US policy on Mexican immigration into the United States. Again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you guys have a wonderful rest of your weekend or rest of your week whenever, of course, you watch this video. Thank you so much, as always, for watching Zay Historicizes. And yeah, I hope you guys have a fabulous rest of your week. Thank you so much. Bye.